We have been hearing over these last weeks the 23rd Psalm. We have heard it in several incarnations, and we continue with it this week, as we heard from Vera. Our focus verse this week is, "The Lord leads me in right paths for his name's sake." Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Okay, friends, hands in the air. When you were a child, did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up? Did you know what you wanted to be? Yeah? Okay. Now, did you end up pursuing or doing those things? Anybody? I was going to be on Broadway. I'm still waiting for the call, but any day now. If you did not end up pursuing or doing the thing that you wanted to do as a child, do you ever regret not pursuing those dreams? Why didn't you? In stories, in movies, in art, the narrative arc often requires a moment of decision for the protagonist, an event that changes everything, that sets the stage for what will come next, for the direction the characters will travel. They come to a fork in the road. Now, for many of us in the books of our lives, there are forks in the road. There are reasons that we pursue one thing and not another. For me, despite the fact that I put on many a production in my childhood living room for friends and family, the fact that I was always too afraid of making mistakes in choirs and even in voice lessons, I would never sing out. I was too afraid of sounding wrong to know when I was making a mistake. I could never put myself out there enough, and thus any dreams of becoming a great musician were halted, let's say. There are reasons that we do not pursue certain things. Some of these have to do with our fears, some of these have to do with our gifts, some of these have to do with circumstance. But for many of us, these forks come up not, again, once and for all, but we approach them time and again. There are always opportunities to turn, always opportunities and challenges to choose which way to go. As Christians, we are called to discern the right path in these moments of choice and challenge and opportunity. We are called upon to discern, to listen for God's voice, to hear and perhaps to see the path which God might have us pursue. In Quaker communities, there is a tradition of sharing in a discernment or a clearness committee. It is both daunting and powerful to consider having a group from your congregation or your faith community that helps you to discern how you might move forward in times of choice and decision. And one of the ways that this committee helps a person to discern how they might move forward is to look and see where there is evidence of a way closed or a way open. A way closed or a way open. Is it clear that something or all the things are sort of moving in a direction that indicates that this is the way you should go? As you move forward in one direction, are opportunities and things falling into place to make it possible, or are the ways closed? At another point in my life, I thought I might be a journalist. I had in my junior year of college a study abroad experience with a wonderful internship in journalism. And I loved it so much, although it I've maybe said this to some of you before, I had this internship and I wrote feature articles on like the most shallow topics possible. I mean, even for like beauty mags, they were pretty like surface level. So anyway, but I loved the writing nonetheless. I loved the bylines. But when I applied for summer internships in journalism for when I returned home, I didn't get any of them. The way was closed. Now, if it had been still God's path for me, I could have kept applying. But as it happened, I landed in a job with a theater camp at the local YMCA. And working with children in our community, I experienced really the first part of my call to ministry. And so as that one way towards professional journalism closed, another way began to open. Now, sometimes the ways that we expect God's call on our lives to open and close or to express themselves are not always very clear. Parker Palmer is a wonderful writer. He's actually a PhD sociologist, but he writes all these wonderful things about discernment and vocation for the Christian church. And he talks about how as a child, he wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to do, all kinds of stuff around aviation. And he would write these little books all the time. He would... I'm totally thrown off. Good morning. He would write these books over time, and they were all these little aviation booklets, and he'd draw the planes, and he'd write the plans, and he'd map out the courses. And as he grew older, he realized that he was not going to become a pilot. He had terrible eyesight and actually kind of a fear of heights, and it really just wasn't going to work out. So while the way was closed to flight school, he grew up to write many books. So the way that he was expressing this gift for writing and explaining things as a child was still manifest as an adult. It was just not the way that he anticipated. Now, listening for God's voice, trying to discern a way forward, is not to suggest that everything in this life simply unfolds the way that it should. This is the most challenging thing about the doctrine of providence, I think. Sometimes the ways that providence is expressed is just that if it happens, then it must be what God intends. It must be God's will. And that certainly cannot be the case because there is so much suffering in this world. There is so much hardship. Certainly, the ways that life unfolds is not always the way God intends. And we, too, have human freedom. We have options. And sometimes there are many good and holy and faithful choices that we might make. It is a privilege, too, to have the way, more often than not, be open to us. There was a really compelling cartoon making its way around the internet a few months ago, sort of demonstrating what privilege, particularly white privilege, looks like. There were two sides of it. One was a boy and one was a young woman. And in the boys' column, it started out that he was from a loving home where the parents were employed in work that they loved and that they were also paid well for. And in each step of the way, he felt their support. He was able to dedicate his time to his schoolwork after school. He was able to pursue internships, even if they were unpaid, because he didn't have to rely on his own income to support himself or his family. Eventually, he got a job with a friend of the family who worked in a company, and he came up along the way to a wonderful, successful life. In the other column, there was a young woman whose parents were hardworking and loved her and would do anything that they could for her as well. But one of them fell ill, and they did not have sufficient health care. And thus money was always particularly tight. After school, she had to both help out at home and work too in order to help support the family. When she went to school, she couldn't go to as high profile a university, and she had to work all the way through. Those networks were closed to her, and instead she was often chastised for not doing well enough in one area because she was trying to balance so many other things. Eventually, she had to drop out of school and found herself in service positions as waitstaff. And the final frame of the cartoon has someone asking the young man, well, what was the secret to your success? And he says, hard work and initiative. I've sort of done it all on my own. And she is the server in this party thinking, wait a minute, something is not quite right here. It is a privilege to have the way open to you more often than not. Still, regardless of our circumstances, we are called upon to listen for God's voice, to be very clear about the ways in which we have known God's blessing and known the richness of possibility in our lives always, but to think about how we can locate ourselves within the circumstances of our lives. My father fell gravely ill when I was in high school. He had long-time kidney issues stemming from an unchecked strep infection when he was a kid, which is why you'll see me anytime my kid has even the faintest bit of a sore throat, I'm like, get it checked, get it checked. Because when I was 16, his kidneys went into failure, and he had to be on dialysis, and he nearly died. He was lucky. You only need one kidney, and his brother was a match and was able to give. And we are now 20 years out, and he's doing really well. But it was a difficult time. I learned to explore my freedom. I got my driver's license and did all my practice hours driving him to dialysis. That will teach a 16-year-old the burdens of a driver's license very quickly. You're like, I don't know if I want this, actually. Why don't you just hang on to it? It wasn't exactly about joyriding. Now, I cannot certainly say that his illness was a God thing. There was so much that was fraught about it. His recovery from his illness, as he first got used to the drugs that he had to be on, it was a very difficult number of years. Although several good things emerged from it. One, we became very clear as a family about the benefits of a health program that supports those in catastrophic need, particularly with kidney disease. The kidney program is one of the sort of most socialized parts of our healthcare system and is largely supported. And that's a wonderful thing, because all of a sudden he was on $25,000 worth of drugs monthly, and we did not have that. I cannot even fathom what it would have been if he had died. But his illness also precipitated my mother's realization of how reliant we were on his job. He is clergy as well, and we lived in a parsonage. One of our cars was a church car. We would have been utterly devastated if anything had happened to him. And with that realization, she went back to school to get a teaching certificate. And she has spent the last 20 years living into her calling as a teacher. And she's impacted numerous students and our community. Good things emerged from that moment. As we've been living with the words of the 23rd Psalm these past weeks, words of comfort, of ordering our lives in recognition of the Lord as our shepherd, we are called this week to consider the paths set before all of us, as individuals, as members of a community, as people in this congregation. We long to walk with God, I hope. We are called to do so, and God has promised to lead us, not just for our sake, but for God's name's sake. I've been thinking a lot about what that might mean. Sometimes walking along right paths with God requires sacrifice. Sometimes it is a great joy. One of my favorite pastoral writers is Frederick Buechner, and he has this great line about what vocation is. Vocation, your calling in this life, is the place where the world's greatest needs and your heart's deepest passions meet. We are all called to do different sorts of things, but chances are that the place that the world's needs meet and our particular gifts come together, this is the path to pursue. He has great examples about this. He talks about, for example, if your great passion is writing advertising copy for cigarette companies, that's great, but that's probably not what the world needs. So maybe you want to consider using your gifts for a different vocational direction. Anyway, he has all these great examples. Or your heart's, or the world's deepest need is for for someone to go and tend the sick overseas in destitute areas. But that kind of life just breaks your heart and you wouldn't be able to do that. Then that is not your vocation. That's someone else's vocation. So as we, as Christians, are called to listen for God's voice in our vocational lives, we look for those points of meeting. Sometimes walking with God requires sacrifice. Sometimes it is a great joy. Not just in the big forks in the road, not just in moments of vocational or relational decision, but all the time, in all the decisions that we make, we are called to live in this balance, live in this tension. Sometimes walking with God is both difficult and good. We heard the psalm, the 23rd Psalm recited yesterday as we attended a funeral for a longtime family friend, a couple who they were some of my family's first friends in my dad's first church out of seminary. And Bob had developed early Alzheimer's, and he died recently. And we were there, of course, to support him and the family, but also for his wife, Anne. And in the years of Bob's illness, became his primary caregiver, and she was with him every step of the way. She is the tiniest little woman. She is so small and so tiny. And yet he, this hulking 6-something guy, she cared for him. She grew to be able to lift him. She would help him over time. This was, for them, the right choice, that she should be the primary caregiver. But it was both difficult and good. It is hard to know sometimes which path God is calling us to do, but I think it is important to recognize that something can be both difficult and good. God's call, though, on our lives is not meant to be destroying of self or others. Of that we can be sure. John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist movement in which I am ordained, talked about the ways in which God's grace is known throughout our lives. There is the grace that comes before, that Wesley describes, the grace that is sort of present in the world in that providential way, even before we know it. There is that justifying grace that we experience in the moments of real clarity about forks in the roads, the ways in which we are called to reconcile with God, the moments in which we are justified and set right. But the grace that interests me most is the sanctifying grace that we continue to know day in and day out. The sanctifying grace that gave Anne strength as she cared for Bob. The sanctifying grace that makes us more holy, that sanctifies us, that directs us on the roads that we travel and directs us time and again back toward God. As we reach forks in the road in our lives, both dramatic and in small ways. As we reach moments of decisions, as we move towards our annual Giving Sunday on November 8th, we can ask choices. We can ask questions about our choices, about how we are reflecting our walk along God's path. We continue to know God's sanctifying grace, I pray, and I hope that we will hold in our hearts the words of, I think, the 4th century, I didn't write this down, but the church father Irenaeus, who talked about the glory of God is the human person fully alive. As we seek to walk with God and walk God's paths set before us, let us go looking for the things that make us fully alive, not just as individuals, but ourselves and our vocational lives, in our relationships, in our community, in the world, that we might know God's sanctifying grace and that we might glorify the Lord our God. Amen.